You never fought for us. You were such a weak man. My daughter sneered. But when I showed her the video, everything changed. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout-out in our next story. Today's special shout-out goes to Aaron Bradley from Scotland. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. The living room felt smaller than usual, like the walls were closing in. Sophie sat on the edge of the couch, her arms crossed tightly, her legs shaking like it always did when she was mad. The TV was on, some cooking show with too much yelling and clanging pans, but she wasn't watching it. She was staring at David, her dad, like he was the problem, like he was the reason everything had fallen apart. The air was thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. David sat in the armchair across from her, his hands clasped in his lap, his face calm but tired. He didn't look at the TV, didn't look at the floor, just looked at her, steady, like he was waiting for her to say it, to let it all out. Sophie's lips pressed tight, her eyes sharp, her breath caught, quick and uneven. She'd been here for an hour, visiting after weeks of avoiding him, and it hadn't gone well. It never did, not anymore. Not since the divorce, not since Karen had filled her head with stories, lies, excuses. You don't even care, do you? Sophie said finally, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. You just sit there, acting like nothing happened, like you didn't ruin everything. Mom told me you gave up on us. You're weak, Dad. You threw it all away. David didn't flinch, didn't react, but his hands tightened in his lap, his knuckles turning white. He exhaled, deep and measured, like he was trying to stay in control. Sophie waited, her legs shaking faster, her fingers digging into her arms. She wanted him to fight back, to yell, to give her something to push against. But he didn't. He just sat there, his eyes steady, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. You think I'm the bad guy, Sophie? He said, his tone calm but firm, like he'd been holding these words for years. Fine. But you need to see this. Sophie frowned, her heart racing, her eyes narrowing. See what? She said, her voice sharp, suspicious. Another excuse? Another story? I don't want to hear it, Dad. I'm tired of your lies. David stayed silent, letting his actions speak. He stood up, his movements calm and deliberate, like he was carrying something heavy. He crossed the room, his slippers scuffing against the carpet, and stopped at the cabinet near the bookshelf. Sophie watched him, her eyes sharp, her mind racing. She didn't know what he was doing, didn't know what he was looking for, but something in his movements, his silence, made her gut twist, like she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't come back from. He unlocked the drawer, the key clicking loud in the quiet room, and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. It was plain, unmarked, nothing special, but the way he held it, careful, almost reverent, made Sophie's breath catch. He turned, his eyes meeting hers, steady, unreadable. You want to know what really happened? He said, his voice low, calm. Watch this. Sophie's frown deepened, her heart pounding, her fingers curled tight. What is that? She said, her voice sharp, defensive. What are you trying to pull, Dad? I don't need this. I don't need your games. David stayed quiet, letting his actions speak. He walked to the TV, his steps calm, deliberate, and plugged the USB drive into the side. The screen flickered, the cooking show disappearing, replaced by a blank, black screen. Sophie's legs shook faster, her fingers digging into her arms, her mind racing. She wanted to stop him, to tell him to turn it off, to leave her alone. But she didn't. She just sat there, frozen, her eyes glued to the screen, her heart racing like it was trying to break out of her chest. David sat back down, his hands clasped in his lap, his face unreadable. This isn't a game, Sophie, he said, his voice quiet, firm. This is the truth. And you deserve to know it. The screen flickered again, and the footage started playing, grainy, black and white, like something from an old security camera. Sophie squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was their old house, the one they'd lived in before the divorce, before everything fell apart. The timestamp in the corner said it was 3 years ago, when she was 14, when she still thought her family was whole. The front door was in the frame, the porch light flickering, the mailbox crooked like it always was. Sophie's breath caught, her chest tightening, her eyes sharp. What is this? she said, her voice low. Dangerous. Where did you get this? Why do you have this? David exhaled, deep and measured, like he'd been holding his breath for years. I didn't record it, he said, his voice quiet, calm. Someone sent it to me. Anonymously. A year ago. It came in a plain envelope, no note, no return address, just the drive and a single word scribbled on the label. Truth. I don't know who, and I don't know why. But it's real, Sophie. And it's time you saw it. Sophie's eyes widened, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Anonymously, she said, her voice sharp, suspicious. You expect me to believe that? You expect me to trust you after everything? David stayed quiet, letting his actions speak. He nodded, his eyes steady, his voice calm. Watch, he said, his tone firm, final. Then decide. The footage kept playing, and Sophie's eyes snapped back to the screen, her heart racing, her gut twisting. The front door opened, and two men stepped inside, their faces shadowed, their movements casual, like they belonged there. Sophie frowned, her chest tightening, her mind racing. She didn't recognize them, not at first, but something about the way they moved, the way they looked around, made her skin crawl. And then Karen walked into the frame, and Sophie's breath caught, her fingers curled tight. Her mom looked different in the footage, younger, maybe, or just less tired. She was wearing a sundress, the kind she used to wear on summer weekends when they'd go to the park or get ice cream. But there was no park, no ice cream, no normal day. Karen wasn't just greeting the men. She didn't shake their hands or point to a broken sink. She smiled, a big, easy smile, and touched one of the men's arms, her fingers lingering. Then she turned and led them deeper into the house, her hips swaying like she was walking into a party, not their home. Sophie's heart raced, her breaths quick and shallow. What is this? She said, her voice sharp, breaking. What am I looking at, Dad? What is she doing? David stayed quiet, letting the footage speak for itself. He watched her, his eyes steady, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. Keep watching, he said, his tone calm but firm, like he knew this moment was going to change everything. Sophie's eyes snapped back to the screen, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The footage switched to another camera, this one in the hallway. Karen led the men toward the master bedroom, the door half open, the bed visible in the background. Sophie's gut twisted, her fingers quivering, her vision blurring with tears she didn't want to let fall. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, no, no. This isn't real. This can't be real. David exhaled, deep and measured, like he'd been holding his breath for years. I'm sorry, Sophie, he said, his voice quiet, calm. I didn't want you to see this. I didn't want you to know. But you asked for the truth, and now you have it. Sophie's heart raced, her breaths quick and shallow. Why didn't you tell me? She snapped, her voice breaking, tears spilling down her cheeks now, hot and fast. Why did you let me think you were the bad guy? Why did you let me hate you? David looked at her, his eyes tired, sad. Because I didn't want you to hate her, he said simply, his voice quiet, honest. I didn't want you to see this. I wanted to protect you. Sophie laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was sharp, bitter, like glass in her throat. Protect me, she said, her voice shaking. You think this is protecting me? Letting me think you ruined everything? Letting me think you didn't care? David didn't flinch, but his hands tightened in his lap, his knuckles turning white. I cared, he said, his voice low, steady. I cared enough to keep this from you. But you asked for the truth, Sophie. And now you have it. Sophie stood up, her legs shaky, her fingers curled tight. She wanted to scream, to break something, to make sense of the storm in her head. But all she could do was pace, back and forth, her sneakers scuffing against the carpet. I need to talk to her, she said finally, her voice tight, controlled. I need to hear her say it. I need to hear her explain. David nodded, his eyes following her as she moved. Okay, he said, his voice quiet, calm. But Sophie, whatever she says, whatever she tries to tell you, it doesn't change what you saw. It doesn't change the truth. Sophie stopped pacing, her heart racing, her eyes sharp. I know, she said, her voice steady now, cold. But I need to hear it from her. I need to know why. David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his eyes tired, sad. All right, he said, his voice quiet. But I'm here, okay? Whatever happens, I'm here. Sophie nodded, but she didn't look at him. She grabbed her phone from the couch, her fingers quivering as she scrolled to her mom's number. She didn't know what she was going to say, didn't know how she was going to face her. But she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The TV screen flickered, and the room went quiet, except for the faint hum of the old set struggling to keep up. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the grainy black and white footage. At first, it didn't look like much, just the front door of their old house, the one they'd lived in when she was little. The timestamp in the corner said it was 3 years ago, before the divorce, before everything fell apart. She remembered that house, the creaky porch steps, the chipped paint on the door, the way the living room window always got stuck. But this wasn't about memories. This was something else. David sat on the couch, his hands clasped tight, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything, didn't push her to react. He just watched her watch the screen, like he knew this moment was going to change everything. Sophie's legs shook, restless and frantic, her fingers digging into her arms. She wanted to say something, to stop this before it went too far, but the footage kept playing, and she couldn't look away. The front door opened, and 2 men stepped inside. They were wearing jeans and faded t-shirts, one with a baseball cap pulled low, the other with a tool belt slung over his shoulder. Sophie squinted, trying to make sense of it. "Who are they?" she muttered, more to herself than to David. They didn't look familiar, not at first. Maybe they were workers, fixing something in the house. That's what she wanted to think. That's what made sense. But then Karen walked into the frame, and Sophie's gut twisted. Her mom looked different in the footage, younger, maybe, or just less tired. She was wearing a sundress, the kind she used to wear on summer weekends when they'd go to the park or get ice cream. But there was no park, no ice cream, no normal day. Karen wasn't just greeting the men. She didn't shake their hands or point to a broken sink. She smiled, a big, easy smile, and touched one of the men's arms, her fingers lingering. Then she turned and led them deeper into the house, her hips swaying like she was walking into a party, not their home. Sophie's breath caught, sharp and uneven. "What is this?" she said, her voice sharp, but she didn't look at David. She couldn't. The footage switched to another camera, this one in the hallway. Karen led the men toward the master bedroom, the door half open, the bed visible in the background. Sophie's heart raced, loud and fast, like it was trying to break out of her chest. "This isn't real," she said, shaking her head. "This could be fake. You could have edited it." David stayed silent, letting the footage speak for itself. Sophie wanted him to argue, to explain, to give her something to fight against. But he didn't. He just let the footage play, and it felt like a punch to the gut. The men followed Karen into the bedroom, and the door closed behind them. The screen went black for a second, then flickered to another angle. This time, it was inside the room. Sophie's fingers curled tight, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't want to see this. She didn't want to know. But she couldn't stop watching. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough. Karen was laughing, sitting on the edge of the bed, one of the men standing close, too close. The other man was pulling off his tool belt, tossing it onto the floor like it was nothing. Sophie's gut twisted. She wanted to scream, to throw the remote, to make it stop. But she just sat there, frozen, her eyes burning. And then she saw it. The man with the baseball cap turned, and the light caught his face. Sophie's breath hitched. She knew him. It wasn't just some random guy. It was Mr. Carter, the guy who used to live down the street, the one who'd helped her build a birdhouse for a school project when she was 10. She remembered his laugh, loud and booming, the way he'd called her kiddo and ruffled her hair. And now he was here, in her parents' bedroom, breaking everything. "No," Sophie whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no." Her voice was louder now, panicked. "That's Mr. Carter. That's not." She turned to David, her eyes wide, pleading. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me you made it up." David exhaled, deep and measured, like he'd been holding his breath for years. "I didn't make it up, Sophie," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I wish I had. But this is what happened." Sophie's heart raced, her breaths quick and shallow. "Then why didn't you tell me?" she snapped, her voice breaking. "Why did you let me think you were the bad guy? Why did you let me hate you?" David looked at her, his eyes tired, sad. "Because I didn't want you to hate her," he said simply. "I didn't want you to see this. I wanted to protect you. Protect me." Sophie laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was bitter, sharp, like glass in her throat. You think this is protecting me? Letting me think you ruined everything? Letting me think you didn't care?" David didn't flinch, but his hands tightened in his lap, his knuckles turning white. "I cared," he said, his voice low, steady. "I cared enough to keep this from you. But you asked for the truth, Sophie. And now you have it." The footage kept playing, and Sophie's eyes snapped back to the screen, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The bedroom scene was over, thank God, but now it was worse. The camera switched to another room, one she knew too well. Her room. Her childhood bedroom, with the pink walls she'd begged for when she was 7, the posters of her favorite bands taped crookedly above her bed, the stuffed bear she'd named Mr. Fluff sitting on her pillow. And there was Karen, leading the men inside, laughing like it was no big deal, like it wasn't Sophie's space, her safe place. Sophie's whole body went stiff. Her fingers quivered, her vision blurring with tears she didn't want to let fall. "That's my room," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My bed. My stuff. How could she do that there?" David reached for the remote and stopped the video, the screen freezing on Karen's face, mid-laugh. The silence was deafening, heavy, like the air had turned to stone. Sophie stared at the screen, her mind racing, trying to find something, anything, to make this make sense. But there was nothing. No excuse, no explanation, no way to undo what she'd just seen. "I didn't want you to see this," David said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I didn't want you to know. But you kept pushing, Sophie. You kept saying I was weak, that I gave up. And I couldn't let you believe that anymore." Sophie's lips trembled, her eyes still fixed on the frozen image of her mom. "She lied," she said, her voice shaking. "She told me you were the one who ruined everything. She said you didn't care about us. But it was her. It was always her." David nodded, calm and deliberate. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time, his voice cracked. "I'm sorry you had to see this. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from it." Sophie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now, hot and fast. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp. "Don't apologize. This isn't your fault. It's hers." She stood up, her legs shaky, her fingers curled tight. She wanted to scream, to break something, to make sense of the storm in her head. But all she could do was pace, back and forth, her sneakers scuffing against the carpet. "I need to talk to her," she said finally, her voice tight, controlled. "I need to hear her say it. I need to hear her explain." David nodded, his eyes following her as she moved. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet, calm. "But Sophie, whatever she says, whatever she tries to tell you, it doesn't change what you saw. It doesn't change the truth." Sophie stopped pacing, her heart racing, her eyes sharp. "I know," she said, her voice steady now, cold. "But I need to hear it from her. I need to know why." David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his eyes tired, sad. "All right," he said, his voice quiet. "But I'm here, okay? Whatever happens, I'm here." Sophie nodded, but she didn't look at him. She grabbed her phone from the couch, her fingers quivering as she scrolled to her mom's number. She didn't know what she was going to say, didn't know how she was going to face her. But she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The living room felt too quiet after the footage stopped, like the air was holding its breath. Sophie stood by the couch, her phone clutched tight in her hand, her thumb hovering over her mom's name. Her heart raced, her breaths quick and shallow, her eyes red from crying, but her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a thin line. David watched her from the other side of the room, his hands in his pockets, his face calm but tired. He didn't say anything, didn't push her. He just waited, like he knew this moment was hers to decide. Sophie tapped the screen, her fingers shaky but firm, and held the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times, each sound like a hammer in her head. She paced, her sneakers scuffing against the carpet, her free hand balled into a fist. Finally, there was a click, and Karen's voice came through, warm and familiar, like nothing was wrong. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her tone light, practiced. "What's up? You don't usually call this late." Sophie's grip squeezed the phone, her knuckles turning white. She didn't ease into it, didn't soften the blow. "I saw the videos," she said, her voice tight, controlled, like she was holding back a scream. "I know what you did." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Sophie could hear the faint hum of the TV in the background, the clink of a glass being set down. Then Karen laughed, a short, nervous sound that didn't reach her voice. Videos? What are you talking about, Sophie? What videos? Sophie's jaw clenched, her teeth grinding together. Don't, she snapped, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. Don't lie to me. I saw the security footage. You, Mr. Carter, the other guy. In our house. In my room. I saw everything. Another pause, longer this time, and Sophie could almost picture her mom's face, eyes wide, lips parted, searching for a way out. Then Karen exhaled, calm and deliberate, like she was trying to stay in control. Sweetie, listen, she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. That was a long time ago. It doesn't mean anything. It was a mistake, okay? A stupid mistake. Sophie laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was sharp, bitter, like something breaking inside her. A mistake, she said, her voice rising. You did it in my room, Mom. My bed. My stuff. You let those guys, Mr. Carter, who I trusted, in there like it was nothing. And you call that a mistake? Karen's tone shifted, sharper now, defensive. You don't understand, Sophie, she said, her voice losing its softness. You're young. You don't get it. There's more to this. I was lonely, okay? Your father, he wasn't there. He was always working, always distant. I needed someone to see me, to care. Sophie's eyes flashed, her heart pounding. Don't make this about him, she snapped, her voice shaking with anger. This isn't about Dad. This is about you. You lied to me. You let me hate him. Let me think he ruined everything when it was you. You broke us. Karen sighed, loud and frustrated, like Sophie was being unreasonable. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, her voice tight. I didn't want you to know. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me? Sophie's voice cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks again, hot and fast. You let me hate him instead. You let me think he didn't care when he was the one trying to keep me from this. You used me, Mom. You used me to hurt him. The line went quiet, and Sophie could hear her mom breathing, sharp and uneven. Then Karen's voice came back, lower, colder. So this is what we're doing now, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Dragging you into our mess? He had to show you, huh? Had to play the hero, make me the villain? Sophie's grip on the phone tightened, her nails digging into her palm. He didn't drag me into anything, she said, her voice steady now, sharp as a knife. I asked for the truth. And you're the one who lied. Just come here, Mom. I need to see you. I need to hear you say it to my face. There was another pause, then a flurry of words, too fast, too controlled, like Karen was trying to get ahead of it. Sophie, listen, I can explain, okay? It's not what you think. Let me come over tomorrow. We'll talk. No. Sophie cut her off, her voice firm. Now, I'm at Dad's. Come here, or don't bother calling me again. She didn't wait for a response. She hung up, the phone slipping from her fingers onto the couch, her legs shaking faster now, her fingers shaky but firm. David watched her, his gaze warm, watchful. You okay? He asked, his voice quiet. Sophie shook her head, her lips trembling. No, she said, her voice breaking. But I need to do this. I need to see her. David nodded, his hands still in his pockets. All right, he said. I'm here, okay? Whatever happens. Sophie didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her mind racing, her heart pounding. It didn't take long. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door, sharp and loud, like Karen was already annoyed. Sophie didn't move. David stood up, crossed the room, and opened the door. Karen stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood, her coat draped over her arm like she was walking into a meeting, not a fight. She didn't look at David, didn't even glance his way. Her eyes locked on Sophie, her face cold, unreadable. What is this about, Sophie? She asked, her tone light, practiced, like she was trying to keep control. You're calling me in the middle of the night, yelling about videos. What's going on? Sophie stood up, her fingers balled tight, her eyes sharp. I saw the footage, she said again, her voice steady now cold. You, Mr. Carter, the other guy? In our house. In my room. Don't lie to me, Mom. Just tell me the truth. Karen's reaction was instant. A flicker of something in her eyes, shock, panic, before she smoothed it over with an easy scoff. What videos? She said, her voice light, like Sophie was being dramatic. "Sweetie, I don't know what you think you saw, but stop," Sophie snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I saw it. I saw you. Don't pretend it didn't happen. Don't pretend you didn't lie." Karen exhaled, calm and deliberate, her lips curving into something that might have passed for amusement if Sophie didn't know better. "So this is what we're doing now," she said, gesturing vaguely at the space between them. "Dragging you into our mess? He had to show you, huh? Had to make me the bad guy?" David stayed quiet, his silence heavy with truth. Sophie's eyes flashed, her heart pounding. "He didn't drag me into anything," she said, her voice sharp. "I asked for the truth. And you're the one who lied. Just tell me why, Mom. Why did you do it? Why did you lie?" Karen sighed, like she was exhausted by all of this. "Sweetheart, that was a long time ago," she said, her voice softening, almost gentle. "It meant nothing. It was a mistake, okay? I was unhappy, Sophie. Your father, he wasn't there. He was cold, distant, always too busy with work to even notice me." Sophie flinched, her fingers curled tight. "Don't make this about him," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't about Dad. This is about you. You did it in my room, Mom. My safe place. And you let me hate him instead of telling the truth." Karen's face hardened, her voice losing its softness. "You don't get it, Sophie," she said, her tone sharp now, defensive. "There's more to this. Your father, he wasn't perfect, Sophie. He wasn't the hero you think he is. Ask him about the nights he didn't come home, the weekends he spent at the office. Ask him why I felt so alone." Sophie's eyes widened, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice low, dangerous. "He didn't cheat. He didn't lie. You did." Karen smiled, a small, bitter smile, like she knew something Sophie didn't. "Maybe not," she said, her voice quiet. "But he stopped loving me a long time ago, and I wasn't going to waste my life waiting for him to care." Sophie stared at her, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream, to break something, to make sense of the storm in her head. But all she could do was stand there, her fingers quivering, her eyes burning. "I don't care about your relationship," she said finally, her voice steady, cold. "I care that you lied to me. I care that you used me. I care that you broke us." Karen hesitated, her eyes narrowing, like she was trying to find a way out. Then she sighed, shaking her head. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice soft again, almost pleading. "I thought I was protecting you." Sophie's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. "So you let me hate him instead," she said. "That's not protection, Mom. That's betrayal." Karen's face hardened, her control slipping. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice cold now, final. Sophie stared at her for a long moment, her heart pounding, her eyes sharp. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed upstairs, her footsteps loud against the stairs, the door to her old bedroom clicking shut behind her. Karen exhaled heavily, shaking her head. "Dramatic," she muttered, like Sophie was being unreasonable. David stayed quiet, his silence heavy with truth. She turned to leave, already pulling out her phone, probably to call Sophie and spin this a different way. But something told David it wouldn't work this time. She didn't even make it to her car before she called, and he could hear the vibration of Sophie's phone upstairs. But Sophie didn't pick up. The morning light was soft, filtering through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the table. Sophie sat there, her hands clutching a mug of tea she hadn't touched, her eyes glued to the steam curling up into the air. The house was quiet, too quiet, like it was waiting for something to happen. David moved around the kitchen, his slippers scuffing against the tile, his movements calm and deliberate, like he didn't want to break the silence. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the smell filling the room, warm and familiar, but it didn't feel like home. Not yet. Sophie's leg shook under the table, her fingers tapping against the mug, her mind still spinning from last night. The confrontation with Karen, the way her mom's excuses had twisted like knives, the way she'd stormed upstairs and slammed the door, it all felt like a dream, hazy and sharp at the same time. She hadn't slept much, just tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look. And now, sitting here, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something big and final, and she didn't know how to step forward. David sat down across from her, his coffee steaming, his hands wrapped around the mug like hers. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, his gaze warm, watchful. Sophie glanced up, meeting his gaze for a second, then looked away, her lips pressed tight. She didn't know how to start, didn't know how to say what she needed to say. But she had to. She couldn't go back, not after everything. I don't want to live with her anymore, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, like she'd been practicing the words all night. Can I stay here? With you? David blinked, his hands tightening around his mug, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded, calm and deliberate, like he'd been expecting this. This is your home now, he said, his voice low, warm. You can stay as long as you want, Sophie. Always. Sophie exhaled, her shoulders easing a little, but not all the way. She nodded, her eyes dropping to the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Okay, she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. I don't want to see her right now. I just want to be here, with you. David nodded again, his eyes steady, his voice calm. All right, he said. We'll figure it out. One step at a time. Sophie looked up at him, studying his face, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair. He looked tired, older than she remembered, but there was something solid about him, something steady. She hadn't seen it before, not really, not when she was so busy hating him, blaming him. But now, sitting here, she saw it. He was here. He'd always been here, even when she didn't want him to be. She didn't know what to feel: anger, hurt, confusion, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. David was here, and that was enough. I need to get my stuff, she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. Today. I don't want to wait. David nodded, setting his mug down. Okay, he said. We'll go together. Whenever you're ready. Sophie stood up, her chair scraping against the tile, her fingers trembling. She grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair, pulling it on, her movements quick, decisive. David watched her, his eyes following her as she moved, like he was making sure she was okay, making sure she wasn't going to break. But she wasn't. Not today. They drove to Karen's house in silence, the radio off, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal. Sophie stared out the window, watching the houses blur by, the trees, the street signs. She didn't want to think about what was coming, didn't want to picture her mom's face, her voice, her excuses. She just wanted to get her stuff and leave, fast, clean, done. When they pulled up to the house, the front door was already open, like Karen had been waiting. Sophie's gut twisted, her fingers curled tight, but she didn't hesitate. She got out of the car, her sneakers hitting the pavement, her steps quick, determined. David followed, his hands in his pockets, his face calm but watchful. Karen was standing in the living room, her arms crossed tight, her face cold, unreadable. She didn't look at David, didn't even glance his way. Her eyes locked on Sophie, her expression cold, dismissive. So that's it, she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. You're just leaving? Sophie didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. Yeah, she said, her voice steady, firm. I am. Karen's lips curled into a dry, humorless laugh, her head shaking like Sophie was being ridiculous. You're making a mistake, Sophie, she said, her tone sharp, dismissive. You'll come back. You always do. Sophie didn't answer. She walked past her, her shoulder brushing against the wall, her steps loud against the hardwood. She didn't look back, didn't give Karen the satisfaction of a reaction. She went straight upstairs, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling. David stayed in the living room, his arms crossed, his eyes on Karen, like he was making sure she didn't follow. Sophie's room was the same as always: pink walls, posters, the bed with the faded quilt, the desk cluttered with books and pens. But it didn't feel like hers anymore, not after what she'd seen, not after what Karen had done. She grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, her movements quick, mechanical. She stuffed in clothes, jeans, t-shirts, hoodies, not bothering to fold them. She grabbed her laptop, her charger, her favorite books from the shelf. And then she saw it, Mr. Fluff, her old stuffed bear, sitting on the bed, his fur matted, his button eyes crooked. She hesitated, her hand hovering, then picked him up, holding him tight against her chest. Something felt off, though, heavier than it should have been. She frowned, turning Mr. Fluff over, her fingers brushing against a loose seam in his back. She pulled at it, and something slipped out, a small, leather-bound notebook, worn and creased, like it had been hidden there for years. Sophie's breath caught, her fingers shaky but firm as she opened it. The handwriting was Karen's, tight and slanted. The ink faded but clear. She flipped to the first page, her eyes scanning the words, and her gut twisted. I feel like I'm drowning, Karen had written, the date from 5 years ago, before the divorce. David's always working, always gone. He doesn't see me, doesn't hear me. I'm invisible, and I can't do this alone. She flipped to another page, her breath catching at the words. I'm scared, Sophie. Scared you'll hate me one day. Sophie snapped the notebook shut, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She didn't know what to think, didn't know what to feel. Anger, hurt, confusion, it all tangled together, sharp and heavy. She stuffed the notebook into her bag, her movements quick, almost frantic. She didn't want to deal with this, not now, not here. She grabbed the rest of her things, zipping the bag shut, her fingers shaky but firm. When she came back downstairs, Karen was still standing there, her arms crossed, her face cold. David was by the door, his eyes on Sophie, his expression calm but worried. Sophie didn't look at her mom, didn't say anything. She walked past her, her bag slung over her shoulder, Mr. Fluff tucked under her arm. Karen watched her, her lips pressed tight, her eyes sharp. You really think this makes you the better parent? Karen said, her voice low, bitter, directed at David. Letting her run away like this? David sighed, his hands still in his pockets. This isn't about me, he said, his voice steady. She made her choice. You pushed her too far, Karen. This is on you. Karen's face hardened, her lips curling into something bitter, but she didn't answer. Sophie kept her eyes forward. She walked out the door, her steps quick, determined, the sunlight warm against her face. David followed, his keys jangling in his hand, his presence steady, solid. The drive back was quiet, the radio off, the only sound the hum of the engine. Sophie stared out the window, her bag on her lap, Mr. Fluff resting against her chest. The notebook felt heavy, like it was burning a hole through the fabric, but she didn't open it, didn't look. Not yet. Back at David's house, she unpacked in silence, her movements slow, careful. She hung her clothes in the closet, stacked her books on the desk, set her laptop on the bed. And then she sat down, Mr. Fluff in her lap, the notebook beside her. She didn't open it, didn't read more. She just sat there, staring at the wall, her mind spinning, her heart heavy. David knocked on the door, his voice soft. You okay? He asked, his gaze warm, watchful. Sophie nodded, but it wasn't true. Yeah, she said, her voice quiet. I just need time. David nodded, his hands in his pockets. All right, he said. I'm here. Okay. Whenever you're ready. Sophie nodded again, her eyes dropping to the notebook, her chest tight. She didn't know what to do with it, didn't know what it meant. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going back. Not now, not ever. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the fridge and the occasional drip from the sink. Sophie sat at the table, her elbows resting on the wood, her hands clutching a glass of water she hadn't touched. The light above the stove was on, casting a soft, yellow glow across the room, but it felt dim, like the shadows were heavier than usual. A week had passed since she'd moved in with David, and the house still felt new, unfamiliar, like she was a guest who hadn't figured out where to put her things. But it was better than being with Karen. Anything was better than that. David moved around the kitchen, his slippers scuffing against the tile, his movements calm and deliberate, like he didn't want to startle her. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the smell filling the room, warm and familiar, but it didn't feel like home. Not yet. He sat down across from her, his mug steaming, his hands wrapped around it like hers. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her, his gaze warm, watchful. Sophie glanced up, meeting his gaze for a second, then looked away, her lips pressed tight. She didn't know how to start, didn't know how to say what she needed to say. But she had to. She couldn't keep it inside anymore. I found something, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, like she'd been practicing the words all night. When I was unpacking. In Mr. Fluff. A notebook. It's Mom's. David blinked, his hands tightening around his mug, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded, calm and deliberate, like he'd been expecting this. Okay, he said, his voice low, calm. What did it say? Sophie exhaled, her shoulders easing a little, but not all the way. She reached into her hoodie pocket, pulling out the small, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn and creased, like it had been hidden for years. She set it on the table, her fingers lingering on the edges, her chest tight. "It's her diary," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "From before the divorce. She wrote about you, about how she felt." David's eyes dropped to the notebook, his expression steady but guarded. "And what did she say?" he asked, his voice quiet, like he was bracing himself. Sophie opened the notebook, her fingers shaky but firm as she flipped to the first page. The handwriting was Karen's, tight and slanted, the ink faded but clear. She read aloud, her voice shaking but steady enough. "I feel like I'm drowning," she said, the words heavy in the quiet room. "David's always working, always gone. He doesn't see me, doesn't hear me. I'm invisible, and I can't do this alone." David's face didn't change, but his hands tightened around his mug, his knuckles turning white. Sophie flipped to another page, her eyes scanning the words, her gut twisted. "I met someone today," she read, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "He listens. He cares. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. I need this. I need to feel something." Sophie snapped the notebook shut, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She looked up at David, her eyes sharp, searching. "She wrote that she was lonely," she said, her voice breaking. "That you didn't care. That you gave up on her. Is that true?" David exhaled, deep and measured, like he'd been holding his breath for years. He set his mug down, his hands resting on the table, his eyes steady but tired. "I wasn't perfect, Sophie," he said, his voice low, calm. "I worked a lot, yeah? I was trying to provide for us, for you. But I never cheated. I never lied. I tried to save our marriage, but she didn't want to fix it." Sophie's chest tightened, her fingers curled tight. "But she said you stopped loving her," she said, her voice shaking. "She said you were cold, distant. Did you? Did you stop?" David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, his eyes tired, sad. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet, honest. "Maybe I did. Maybe I got tired of fighting for something she didn't want. But I never stopped caring, Sophie. I never stopped trying. She made her choices, and I made mine. But I didn't do what she did. I didn't break us." Sophie nodded, but it wasn't enough. She opened the notebook again, her fingers flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the words. And then she saw it. A photo, tucked between two pages, its edges worn and creased. She pulled it out, her fingers quivering, her breath catching. It was Karen, smiling, her arm around Mr. Carter, the man from the footage, the man who'd helped her build a birdhouse, who'd sat at their kitchen table. They were standing in front of a park bench, the sun setting behind them, their faces close, too close. She flipped it over, her heart sinking at the handwritten note. "To Kay, always yours, Tom." Tom, Mr. Carter, the man who'd broken everything. The date on the back was from 6 years ago, before the divorce, before everything fell apart. Sophie's gut twisted, her fingers shaky but firm as she set the photo on the table. "This was before," she said, her voice quiet, sharp. "Before the footage. Before you knew. She was with him for years, Dad. Years." David's eyes dropped to the photo, his face unreadable for a moment. Then he exhaled, deep and measured, like he was trying to stay in control. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low, calm. "Not then, but it doesn't surprise me." Sophie's breath caught, quick and uneven. "She lied," she said, her voice breaking. "She lied about everything. She said you were the problem, but it was her. It was always her." David nodded, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from it." He nodded, his eyes steady, but Sophie saw the flicker of pain, the weight of years he'd carried alone. Sophie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now, hot and fast. "Don't," she said, her voice sharp. "Don't apologize. This isn't your fault. It's hers." She stood up, her chair scraping against the tile, her fingers trembling. She wanted to scream, to break something, to make sense of the storm in her head. But all she could do was pace, back and forth, her sneakers scuffing against the floor. "She hasn't called," she said finally, her voice tight, controlled. "Not since we left. Not since she tried to explain. I guess she gave up on me too. David sighed, his hands still on the table, his eyes following her as she moved. Or she doesn't know how to fix it, he said, his voice quiet, calm. She's always been good at pretending things don't exist when they're inconvenient. Sophie stopped pacing, her heart racing, her eyes sharp. She used me, she said, her voice steady now cold. She used me to hurt you. And now she doesn't even care that I know. David nodded, his eyes steady, his voice calm. I know, he said. But you're here now, Sophie. And I'm here. We'll figure it out, okay? One step at a time. Sophie nodded, but it wasn't enough. She sat back down, her fingers balled tight, her eyes dropping to the notebook, the photo. She didn't know what to do with it, didn't know what it meant. But she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6. Moving forward, 902 words. The living room was warm, the glow of the TV flickering across the walls, casting soft shadows that danced with every scene change. Sophie sat on the couch, her legs crossed under her, a bowl of popcorn balanced in her lap. The smell of butter and salt filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of David's coffee from the kitchen. It was movie night, their second one this week, and it felt different now, easier, like the house wasn't just a place to stay anymore. It was starting to feel like home. David sat on the other end of the couch, his feet propped up on the coffee table, a mug in his hands. He was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair messy, his face relaxed, like he didn't have to be on guard anymore. Sophie glanced at him, watching the way the light from the screen reflected in his eyes, the way he smiled at the funny parts, the way he leaned back like he was finally breathing again. She hadn't seen him like this before, not really, not when she was so busy hating him, blaming him. But now, sitting here, she saw it. He was here. He'd always been here. The movie was some old comedy, the kind with too many bad jokes and over-the-top chase scenes, but it didn't matter. It wasn't about the movie. It was about this, the quiet moments, the shared laughter, the way they didn't have to fill the silence with words. Sophie popped a piece of popcorn into her mouth, the crunch loud in the quiet room, and David glanced at her, his smile small but warm. You're gonna eat all that before the good parts, he said, his voice teasing, light. Sophie rolled her eyes, but she smiled, tossing a piece at him. You're the one who burns it half the time, she said, her voice playful. Easy. I'm just making up for your bad cooking. David laughed, catching the popcorn and popping it into his mouth. Hey, I'm getting better, he said, his tone mock offended. You liked the pancakes yesterday, didn't you? Sophie shrugged, her smile widening. They were okay, she said, but she was lying, and he knew it. The pancakes had been fluffy, golden, perfect, and she'd eaten 3 of them, drowning them in syrup, laughing when he tried to flip one and it landed on the counter. It was a small thing, but it felt big, like a piece of something they'd lost was coming back, slow but steady. The movie played on, the characters running through a crowded street, shouting and tripping over each other, and Sophie leaned back, her head resting against the couch. It had been a month since she'd moved in, a month since she'd walked out of Karen's house, her bag slung over her shoulder, Mr. Fluff tucked under her arm. A month since she'd found the diary, the photo, the truth. And it still hurt, still ached, but it was different now, softer, like a bruise that was starting to fade. David had been patient, steady, like he always was. He didn't push her, didn't ask too many questions, didn't try to fix everything. He just let her be, let her figure it out, piece by piece. They'd started small traditions, like movie nights and cooking together, and it helped, more than she thought it would. The first time they'd made dinner, he'd burned the garlic bread, the smoke detector blaring, and she'd laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. It was messy, chaotic, but it was theirs, and that mattered. It wasn't perfect, wasn't fixed, but it was theirs. Sophie reached for her phone, checking the screen, her thumb hovering over the messages. Karen hadn't called, hadn't texted, not since that first week, when her excuses had turned to guilt trips, then demands, then silence. Sophie had read every message, every plea, every attempt to explain, but she hadn't replied, not really. The most she'd sent was a short, clipped, I need time, and then nothing. She didn't regret it, didn't want to go back, but it still felt weird, like a piece of her was missing, even if she didn't want it back. She locked her phone, setting it down, her eyes drifting to the coffee table, where the notebook still sat, its cover worn and creased. She hadn't read more, hadn't wanted to, but she hadn't thrown it away either. It was there, waiting, like a question she wasn't ready to answer. But she knew she had to, eventually. Not for Karen, but for herself. "I'm gonna write her a letter," Sophie said finally, her voice quiet but steady, like she'd been practicing the words all night. "Mom, I need to tell her how I feel, set some boundaries. I'm not ready to see her, but maybe one day." David nodded, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "That's a good idea," he said, his tone warm, supportive. "Take your time, Sophie. There's no rush. You do what feels right for you." Sophie nodded, her shoulders easing a little, but not all the way. She grabbed a piece of paper from the coffee table, a pen from the drawer, and sat back down, her fingers shaky but firm. She didn't know how to start, didn't know what to say, but she wrote anyway, the words spilling out, messy and raw. "Mom," she wrote, her handwriting shaky, the ink smudging a little. "I'm not ready to forgive you, not yet. You hurt me, hurt Dad, hurt us. You lied, and I can't forget that. I need space, time to figure things out. Maybe one day we can talk, but not now. I'm staying with Dad, and I'm okay. I hope you find a way to be okay too, but I can't fix this for you. Not anymore." She signed her name, her hand steady now, her heart lighter, like a weight had lifted, but not all the way. She folded the letter, slipping it into an envelope, her fingers lingering on the edges. She didn't know if she'd send it, didn't know if Karen would read it, but it didn't matter. It was for her, for closure, for moving forward. David watched her, his gaze warm, watchful. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, like he didn't want to push. Sophie nodded, but it wasn't true. "Yeah," she said, her voice quiet. I thought she cared more, you know? She always said you were the one who gave up on us. But now I see it was you all along. I'm glad I'm here." David's eyes softened, his smile small but warm. "I'm glad you're here too," he said, his voice low warm. "We'll figure it out, Sophie. One step at a time." Sophie nodded, her heart lighter, her eyes drifting to the TV, the movie still playing, the characters laughing, running, living. She leaned back, her head resting against the couch, her hands wrapped around the bowl of popcorn. It wasn't perfect, wasn't fixed, but it was enough. It wasn't whole, wasn't healed, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up, and Sophie glanced at it, her breath catching. It was Karen, a text, short and simple, but it hit like a punch. "I'm sorry," it read. "I want to fix this. Please." She remembered Karen's voice, warm and pleading, the way she'd say "sweetie," like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong, and Sophie wasn't ready to hear it. Sophie stared at the screen, her chest tight, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what to feel. Anger, hurt, hope, it all tangled together, sharp and heavy. She locked her phone, setting it down, her fingers shaky but firm. She didn't reply, didn't delete it, just let it sit there, a question she wasn't ready to answer. But she kept it, left the door open, just a crack, for someday. David glanced at her, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "You okay?" he asked again, his tone gentle, concerned. Sophie nodded, her smile small but real. "Yeah," she said, her voice quiet. "I think I will be." The movie played on, the laughter filling the room, warm and bright, and Sophie leaned back, her head resting against the couch, her heart lighter, her breath steadier. It wasn't perfect, wasn't fixed, but it was theirs, and that mattered. For the first time in a long time, it mattered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new tale. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.